you all. Can you hear me? Okay, we'll turn it up just a hair. Thank you all for coming here. Many of you we know. My name is Penny Wright. I'm in charge of adult programs here. Before we introduce our guests, I just wanted to make a few quick announcements. Many of you live in our library district and get our newsletter, but if you do not, we have some July newsletters on the table. We also have some flyers for various events that are coming up this summer. I won't go into detail, just to tell you that we have an awful lot going on. So we have a selection of flyers on the table. Please help yourselves. I wanted to mention that the co-sponsor of today's talk is WPPB radio station in Southampton. And Megan Noonan, who's on our staff, and who also, by the way, has a Sunday evening show on that station, asked the station if they would be a co-sponsor of today's talk, because our guest, as you know, has a show on that station as well. So we wanted her just to say a couple of words about programming at that station. So Megan will do that, and then we'll introduce our guest.
I know. Hey everyone, can you hear me? Yes. All right, good. Anyway, I work for the library, so many of you probably recognize me from around here. I work under Penny. Thank you all for coming. And I also have a show on WPPB. So when Penny talked to me about Laurence's book, and I said he does the program over there, that's great, a new show, maybe I can get PPB to co-sponsor, and they agreed. So they did the underwriting for this, and so you may have heard I don't know, heard the radio ad, that was me. So I did that, and as a PPB person, and so I was wearing two hats for this. But I just wanted to say a little bit about the station, just that WPPB is Long Island's only NPR station. And we are listener supported, and I just wanted to thank you for being a part of that community. And it's really cool when stuff like this happens, and like people come together. That, like I don't know Laurence, and now I know Laurence, and the fact that he's at the library where I work, and the station is like as the crow flies over there. So we have a wonderful community here in Southampton, and a wonderful radio station that just need your listening support. So I'm going to put, we have great, scheduling. I'll just put that. You can grab that on the way out if you like. And then I'll put on my Rogers Memorial Library hat and give the floor back to Penny so she can introduce Lauren properly. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we'll get started. I do, however, have to thank Annette Hinkle. I don't know if you know, but she's writing for the press these days. She was with the Sag Harbor Express for a long time, and she wrote a wonderful article about the book that Laurence Maslon wrote. And that book was the reason, that review of his book, it's sort of a profile of him, caught my eye, and Mr. Maslon was gracious enough to say that he would come here. And for those of you who don't know too much about him, I'm going to tell you a few things. Laurence Maslon is an arts professor at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, as well as associate chair of the graduate acting program. He's the writer and co-producer of the American Masters documentary titled Sammy Davis Jr., I Gotta Be Me. He's also the host and producer of the radio series Broadway to Main Street on WPPB. His most recent book is a history of recorded music from Broadway, titled Broadway to Main Street, How Show Music Enchanted America. By the way, for sale after, for those of you who may be interested. Laurence Maslon edited the two-volume set, American Musicals, 1927 to 1969, containing 16 classic Broadway librettos, published by the Library of America to national acclaim. And he wrote the American Masters documentary, Richard Rogers, The Sweetest Sounds, in 2001. And with producer-director Michael Cantor, he co-wrote the PBS series Make 'em Laugh, which received an Emmy nomination, and 2 episodes of the Emmy-winning Broadway, the American Musical, as well as its companion volume. Mr. Maslon has served on the nominating committee for the Tony Awards from 2007 to 2010. He has written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, for Opera News, Stage Bill, and American Theater. His next project is the companion volume to the Broadway phenomenon, Come From Away. It is such an honor to have him here today. Please welcome Laurence Maslon.
I'm wondering if I can dispense with the mic. Can you all hear me in the back? Let's do that, shall we? Thank you so much for having me. I was on Broadway this morning, and I took the jitney out, and here I'm sort of proverbially on Main Street. So I'm happy to take that journey. And I want to thank the Rogers Memorial Library and Penny for having me out. It's funny, when I grade papers, when I must, for surveys in American Musical Theater that I teach at NYU, the first thing I write on the board on the first day is, if you spelled Richard Rogers' name incorrectly, you will automatically get a C. And Richard Rogers' name is R-O-D-G-E-R-S. So when I see Rogers Memorial Library, I have this sort of Pavlovian response. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, not so much about my book, but a little bit more about what my book covers. I'll play some stuff as best we can here, and then we'll open it up for some questions afterwards, which I'm sure you have several, which I hope you have several. So I'm going to start by reading the epigraph of my book. And you all know that an epigraph is a quotation at the front of any book. And this is from a man I had the privilege to know, a man named George Firth, who was the book writer for Company, the book writer for Merrily We Roll Along, the book writer for The Act. He was also an actor. That's how he got his start in radio, and then he went to New York in the 50s, and Dustin Hoffman was his understudy in the first show he was ever in on Broadway, and he was in every television show you ever saw in the 1960s and 70s, so literally every one. He was in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, he was in Shampoo, you name it, and we became very good friends because he appreciated my love for the American musical theater, and I would meet him in airports, and people would stop him and say, "I recognize your face from movies," and he said, "Yeah, porno." And that would always sort of quiet people down fairly quickly. But he was, to me, a kind of Homer in the ancient sense. He would tell me every single story, many of which I cannot tell you because there would be libel laws even here in the basement of Rogers Memorial Library. But he told me this story once, and it was such an inspiration for me, and I'll read it. I grew up in Evanston, in the suburbs of Chicago, and I was about 12 when the first National Touring Company of Oklahoma came to town at the Erlanger Theater. A friend of mine in junior high school said, "Oh, you absolutely have to go downtown to see it. It's such a wonderful show, and every song you hear on the radio is in it." And I took the train downtown, and I got my tickets, and I saw it, and it was wonderful. Except I remember being so disappointed that rum and Coca-Cola wasn't in the show. So that's sort of my interest has always been piqued as I'm not exactly a Broadway baby. I grew up in Long Island, Up Island in Nassau County, and the first show I ever saw was 1776. Not in 1776, but in 1969 with the original company. And obviously, you're all a stone's throw, more or less, either metaphorically or literally, from Broadway, and you know what a special place it is. But as I sort of learned about shows and things, I found that they were fairly complicated, to the point that when I grew up, even in the 60s into the 70s, Broadway music was the popular music of America. And I became fascinated about how people discovered this music and what it meant. And Broadway, I'm going to assume you've all been to at least one Broadway show, is what it was in 1904, so 2 centuries long. It's really 12 square blocks in the middle of the most expensive real estate in the Western world. Broadway hasn't moved, filmmaking has moved all over the world, but Broadway is still Broadway. And you open you open a show on one of those 12 square blocks, and you have a Broadway musical. And its reach is enormous, and it's evolving, and it changes. But our notion of what Broadway means, it means something special, right? I always think that Broadway is greater than the sum of its parts. It has a kind of magic. It has a tradition. We experience some of that tradition earlier in the month with the Tony Awards, right? People come and have certain sort of expectations. You go to a Broadway theater and it's not like watching Lawrence of Arabia on your iPhone. You get out of the subway, you're in Times Square, bright lights, which have also changed considerably in the last 50 years. You drink before the show, your $28 drink during the show. Maybe you see a celebrity across the way. Maybe you may actually be lucky, and I use the word advisedly and intently, to see an understudy go on, right? And that's always a magical thing. And you go out for drinks afterwards, or whatever. It is greater than the sum of its parts. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is legends of Broadway. Of course, there are legends in almost every field. You know, maybe not accounting, I don't know. But certainly Broadway is legendary because you saw that show that night with those people. And it's not recorded. I get asked a lot, because I work on television, why can't we see, I don't know, I'll pick a show from a couple of years ago. What would that be? Dirty Rotten Scoundrels or something. Why can't we see that on TV? Well, it's a union issue, frankly. To film a lot of these shows for public consumption is simply impossible, financially speaking. What we do have, however, is the music. And how that music reached people all over the country and all over the world became fascinating to me, because I would start to hear music from Broadway shows sung by people who had nothing to do with Broadway. And the dirty little secret I'll share with you is sometimes I liked it better. And I was fascinated by how people interpreted that music. And Broadway music is a lot about content and context, right? This is like the next 90 seconds is as heavily pedagogical as I'm going to get. But every song has content, right? It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But a Broadway song has context. It's not just a sort of generic song about, hey, I love you, you look cute, what do you do Tuesday, right? And certainly from the 1940s on, but frankly, from the get-go, it had to serve a purpose on the stage. Sometimes in the teens or 20s, there was a tap dance number or a love song written because the producer was having an affair with the chorus girl and, you know, wanted to make nice with her. Sometimes in the case of Oklahoma, you wanted to tell part of the story through song. Occasionally, obviously, that grows and grows, and now we have huge dance moments in theater. If you ever saw, say, Billy Elliot on Broadway, you saw how dance tells that kind of story. So these songs are kind of special, and I also often get asked, because I've been hosting this show now for 8 years, here around the corner, is why didn't they record Anything Goes in 1934? Why did they record Of the I Sing in 1932? Why didn't they record Pal Joey in 1940? What was wrong with them? Well, what was wrong with them was two things, and I'll take you, a little bit through this journey. Taste and technology. And taste, technology is really the larger part of that. I'm going to assume also that many of you have pianos in your home, or your parents had pianos, or your grandparents had pianos. At the turn of the century, when Broadway, turn of the previous century, when Broadway was growing and becoming what it was, everybody had a piano, but there were no gramophones, there was certainly no radio, and there was certainly no television. So what did people bring into their parlor to entertain themselves after school or at night or on weekends? Sheet music. And some of the sheet music from this period, from about 1893 to about 1928, is extraordinarily beautiful. I mean, they're frameable. I have a lot of them in my home, because they sent the magic of Broadway to homes all over the world. If you had a song like After the Ball, which you may know, was the first million-selling piece of sheet music of all time in 1895, that was nice. But if you had a piece of sheet music that said Al Jolson starring in Wonder Bar, or Eddie Cantor in the Ziegfeld Follies of 1919, or Fanny Brice sings My Man from the Ziegfeld Follies of 1922, or maybe even Bill from something called Showboat in 1927, written by Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein II, they were prettier, they were more valuable, and they spread the magic of Broadway to every home in America. Of course, when actual recordings come along, they're very primitive in their early things. And I'm going to play something for you, and you see if you can guess who this is. I hope this will work. I can be a little technologically challenged, I'm going to warn you. But here, let's see this.
I'm the kid that's all the candy, I'm a Yankee Doodle dandy, I'm glad I am. So don't protest, I'm a real life Yankee Doodle, make my name and famous Boodle, just like Mr. Doodle did by riding on a pony. I love to listen to the Dixie train, I long to see the girl that's behind me, that ain't a shot. See the Yankee by gosh, oh say, can you see anything about the Yankee that's a phony? I'm a Yankee Doodle dandy, a Yankee Doodle do or die. A real live nephew of my Uncle Sam, born on the 4th of July. Good boy, yeah.
Okay, so that was recorded in 1905. It's from a show called Little Johnny Jones, written by George M. Cohan, music and lyrics. Who are we listening to? No, you couldn't be more wrong, but it was a good guess. George M. Cohan was one of the legendary stars of Broadway. He recorded only 10 songs in his entire lifetime. This was a man named Billy Murray, who was one of the most renowned and commanded the highest fees for a recording artist in the 1900s and the 19-teens, because he sang all the songs on Broadway. No one was interested back then in hearing the original person sing the song. That was of no interest to them. Most music in the teens and 20s was music listened for what purpose at home? Did you guess? For dancing, exactly. You rolled up the living room rug, you moved the furniture, and most of the music from Broadway, by Berlin, by the Gershwins, by Kern, by Cole Porter, these giants, were made famous by dance bands and the dance band meetings. And there's a whole genre of music from this period that I'm guessing, not I, perhaps one or two of you, but certain musicological geniuses can listen to a recording and say, oh, that's George Olsen and his band, or oh, that's Paul Whiteman and his orchestra, right? Back then, band leaders were like basketball stars. Everybody had a band that they loved. And that's pretty much what came out of Broadway, and so that's taste. The other part is technology, right? I tell my students that once upon a time, they were these round, flat, black, circular things with a hole in them, and they were called records, right? But before even those, they were heavy shellac 78 recordings, and I'm sure some of your grandparents had those, right? They were heavy, they were slotted into big cardboard things, and they only played about 3 minutes and 30 seconds per. You had to get up and turn it over, right? And then when that was over, you had to go and put it there. They used to be record changers, but not really until the 40s and 50s. So the idea that you would take this Broadway show, which was 2.5 hours long, and might have had Ethel Merman, or it might have had Al Jolson, or Eddie Cantor, or you name it, and try to get all 78 minutes of music in a 2-hour show was ridiculous. No one could do it. But the English tried. I'm going to play you a little something that I really love. And
I've got the you don't know the half of it here in blue. The trouble is you have so many problems to choose. With your permission, it's my ambition just to go through life saying me to wife. I've got the you don't know the half of it here in blue.
That's great, George. That's good, Freddie. Let's do it again. So we're obviously listening to whom? Who's playing the piano? George Gershwin is playing the piano and Fred Astaire is singing and dancing. Okay? This is the Half of the Deary Blues. It's from a show called Lady Be Good, which opened on Broadway in 1924 with Fred and his sister Adele. Big hit, it moved to London. But this is recorded in London because somehow the British kind of figured it out sooner that wouldn't we like a recording of the original people doing what they did on stage that night. And so these are one of these gifts, these little treasures that sort of pop up in the 20s and 30s. But gradually, as the musical theater starts to get more linear and starts to get more narrative and starts to tell bigger stories and more complex stories, the recording industry, a little bit against its will, starts putting things out on disc for recording that are, I think, rather extraordinary. Let's see if you can guess who this person is. Some of you will, I'm sure.
He had so many play-bites, he didn't know where to rob. He kept looking for an honest man, said I'm going to find him if I can. If I could meet Diogenes today, this is what I'd say. Rub-a-dub-dub, hop out of your tub, Diogenes. Oh, Diogenes, find the man who's honest. Oh, Diogenes, wrap him up for me. Oh, Diogenes, find the man who's solid, solid. Hook that fish if he's in the sea. Hunt him, trail him.
Anybody get any guesses?
Rudy Valley.
Who said Rudy Valley? Well done. So Rudy Valley,
Stole it from me.
really? Did you say Rudy Valley? You boosted her answer? Okay, well, I'll let you two sort that out. Rudy Valley obviously was one of the #1 singers of the 30s and 40s, and he was a recording artist for Decca Records. And Decca got very interested, a man named Jack Kapp, who was the president, in recordings for Broadway. He saw something there. Also because the work of Rodgers and Hart, this is from The Boys from Syracuse, 1938, was a little better than most of the crap that you got from Hollywood in those days, right? The #1 song in 1938, I think, was The Music Goes Round, right? The Music Goes Round, oh, 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 it comes out here. One of the most meritless songs ever written. But Rodgers and Hart in New York were doing something different. And this was released, Rudy Valley and, I'm spacing on her name, Frances Langford, sang a bunch of songs from The Boys from Syracuse. They were they were 4 discs, heavy discs, so 2 on each side. And instead of just singing the big all-hit song from that show, which would be, one of the love ballads or stuff, they started to sing some of the songs that had something to do with the show. Because back in the day, with the texture of the show, back in the day, the music publisher said, oh, anything goes, all right, the big hits are going to be, anything goes, and we're at the top, send it out, record it. And later on, if you saw the show, you noticed a lot more interesting numbers, or chorus numbers, or Act 1 numbers that weren't the hit. So Kapp thought maybe there was a more varied idea. And he was experimenting with this, and then all of a sudden, this horrible thing happened in 1942. And you're all going to say it's World War II, and yes, that was terrible, but that's not the problem with the recording industry. The American Federation of Musicians went on strike. They had a guy who made Jimmy Hoffa look like a church mouse, a guy named James Petrillo. And he was a die-hard representative of his union. He said, I don't care about musicology, I just want my musicians to have dinner on the table. And for lots of reasons, there was mechanized music and jukeboxes and stuff on the radio, he said, no, unless you raise the basic rate for our musicians to play, to get some royalties from these recordings, they're not going into a recording studio. This ban went on for almost 2.5 years. And the recording industry was like, well, if we can't get musicians in the studio, what do we do? So they re-released a lot of old recordings. Rudy Valley made a recording of a song from a show called Everybody's Welcome by Herman Hupfield. Yes, that Herman Hupfield. A song called As Time Goes By. He recorded it in 1931, and it was largely completely forgotten. But lo and behold, in 1943, a movie came out called Casablanca. So they said, well, at least let's get that on the radio. Bring it up from the basement, and they put it on the radio, and it became a big hit. But they were really stymied. And the big problem was, on April 1st, 1943, this thing opened on Broadway called Oklahoma, 75 years ago. And people were going nuts because it was a cultural phenomenon. It was in every paper. It was a big hit, cover of all the magazines, but no one could hear it because of the musician strike. So they rushed some people in, and here is the first recording of anything from Oklahoma. It was released, I think, maybe a month or two after the show opened. See if you guess who this is. And what's odd about it.
Don't throw bouquets at me. Don't please my folks too much. Don't laugh at my joke too much. People will say we're in love.
Okay, first who can tell me what's strange about that recording?
All voices.
Right? Who said it's voices only?
Voices?
Voice, it's a cappella, right? There are no musicians, right? So they had to put these glee clubs in the studios, and it doesn't sound anything like what was going on in the St. James Theater in 1943. Anybody know who was singing that? You'll know one person, you won't know the other. Bing Crosby and? No, a woman named Trudy Irwin, who only made a couple. But they got these out. Sinatra made a recording of Oh, What a Beautiful Morning, backed up by a glee club. They had to get this stuff on the radio because consumers were dying for it. And Jack Kapp ultimately said, you know, I think the strike was January 1st, 1943, enough already. And he settled with he was the first recording executive to settle with the unions. And he settled with them on September 30th. And his first thing to do was to get Oklahoma into the studio. And because he had so little time to get this recording out, because obviously things wasn't digital back then, things simply took longer, he brought the theater orchestra in with the original cast. He had no time to rearrange the score with the dance band, which is what they typically did back then. So whether he wanted to or not, he recorded, whether he thought that far ahead, 12 songs, 6 shellac recordings in a big thick album called Album, because they look like photo albums, called Oklahoma, original Broadway cast, and the world finally got this.
Stories that link my name with yours.
Why do the neighbors gossip all day behind their doors?
I have a way to prove what they say is quite untrue. Here is the gist of practical list of don'ts for you.
That's Joan Roberts and Alfred Drake from the original cast. Sounds a little bit more like what that experience would be. Now remember, this was the war, and you didn't even really have transcontinental air flights. So if you want to know what Broadway was like, this is how you found out. Oklahoma, the cast album, was released on December 1st. One disc jockey in New York on Thanksgiving weekend got an advance copy. He played it. He was besieged by so much mail and phone calls that he played it again the next morning and again the next afternoon on the radio. It was the #1 Christmas present in America in 1943 and went to #1. It cost $5 against singles, which only cost 50 to 25 cents. So it became it was not the first cast album, that belongs to a show called The Cradle of Rock, but its ubiquity was definitely a sign that people wanted to hear the music from Broadway. And what started to happen then, after the war, was a lot of other companies came aboard, Columbia, RCA Victor, and they realized that maybe if they got the rights to these shows and put them in the recording studio, they could have a gold mine. And indeed, many of them did. But what's also interesting to me is this was a time then, I would say from 1943 all the way up to 1971, where it didn't stop there. Right? People would say, Dick and Oscar are doing the show, James Michener book, it's set in the South Pacific, and the music publisher Max Dreyfus is going to bring us some music over so we can see what it's like. And they would go through it and they'd go, this nearly was mine, I don't think that's going to make it. Holly High, yeah, we can get a group to do that, let's chop that one out. Some Enchanted Evening, sounds pretty good to me, let's send that one out. And they would pick which songs would get recorded by recording artists who were also in their, on their bench, right? So here's a recording I love. It's one of my favorite recordings ever, and I'll tell you why. And maybe you'll like it too, and I won't have to tell you. I love
it. I'm gonna wash that man right out of my hair. I'm gonna wash that man right out of my hair. I'm gonna wash that man right out of my hair. Send him on his way. I'm gonna wave that man right out of my arms. I'm gonna wave that man right out of my arms. I'm gonna wave that man right out of my arms. Send him on his way. Don't try to patch it up, tear it up, wash him out, dry him out, push him out, fly him out, cancel him, and let him go. Hey sister, I'm gonna wash that man right out of my hair. I'm gonna wash that man right out of my hair. I'm gonna wash that man right out of my hair. Send him on his way. If you laugh at different comics, if you root for different.
That's great. Anybody know who that is?
Peggy Lee.
Nobody knew about Peggy Lee. I wasn't even going to him. So that's Peggy Lee. She recorded that song in Los Angeles in Capitol Records. Her husband was a band leader named Dave Barber, fantastic arranger. She recorded that song. It was released before South Pacific went into rehearsal back on Broadway. So this was the kind of magic, lightning in a bottle, that people wanted to capture. Now, mind you, there are hundreds of shows and songs that didn't make it, which I'm not going to torture you with. But even a song like Come Rain or Come Shine by Johnny Mercer and Harold Arlen, which is a song that I'm sure you all know, that became a big hit. Ultimately, Margaret Whiting recorded it, but the show it came from was a show called St. Louis Woman, which only ran 111 performances on Broadway. So somehow, sometimes Here's That Rainy Day. You all know that song. That's from a show called Carnival of Flanders, which lasted a week on Broadway. So sometimes these songs would get pulled out of the ether. Let me just play you one more thing from South Pacific.
Once you have found him, never let him go.
Once you have found it, never let go.
I'm not even going to ask you who that is, because you
Yeah.
I need Jan to tell me. All right. Ezio Pinch and Mary Martin. That is the last track on the LP of South Pacific, 1949. What's extraordinary about that last track, if you, maybe some of you grew up with it or had it in your cabinets, that bit of music, and there's another 2 minutes that precede that, is constructed entirely for the album. If you go see South Pacific in the theater, you will not hear that at the end of the show. There's an entirely different scene. But by the late 1940s, right? Remember those flat, round things I talked about with the hole in them? They were now called long playing records. And instead of 3.5 minutes, they could have up about 25 minutes per side. And this proved the perfect vehicle for all these narrative musicals of the 40s and 50s, because you only, as I like to say, turn it over for Act 2, right? Sometimes they were arranged in such a way where the end of Act 1 was at the end of the first side. So you have this experience, you have to get up every 2 minutes. And you had people, this is a Columbia record, a guy named Goddard Lieberson, who I have to give a shout out to. He was the greatest record producer, certainly for cast albums of all time, because he saw the way to not just give you a bunch of songs, but to give you the show in your living room, right? That's why I say Broadway to Main Street. He actually brought the show into your house because of the way he arranged it and engineered it and so on, or created things like this. He saw South Pacific 17 times when it was out of town and made notes on what music, bars here and bars there. Fantastic guy. The other thing was South Pacific, the LP, was on #1, I think for 26 weeks, okay, of all music back in 1949 into 1950. It helped, the score to South Pacific did more than any other piece of music to sell the long playing record to the American public, right? You want South Pacific, you get it on this format. I guess we have to buy one of those, 33 1/3 records and better speakers and so on and so forth. When stereo, I'll play one other thing and then we'll move on from Columbia. You all know what this is.
Bid, I couldn't go to bed. My head's too light to try to set it down. Sleep, I couldn't sleep tonight. Not for all the jewels in the crown. I could have danced all night. I could have danced all night.
So that's obviously our neighbor Julie Andrews. The cast album for My Fair Lady. The cast album of My Fair Lady was on the charts for 480 weeks. It's almost a decade. It is one of the longest selling albums in America. It's probably the longest selling album in American history, right? Everybody had to have that album, and it was so popular that when stereo came in, right, in 1956, 57, Goddard Lieberson flew, because the show was running already, and Rex Harrison and Julie Andrews and Sterling Holloway had moved on and were doing the show in London. He recorded them in stereo in London, because they also wanted to release a stereo recording. And again, these albums were huge. So again, the 50s into the 60s is the era where these songs, these albums, these reminiscences of what Broadway was like became so ubiquitous and so popular, but they were not the only ones, way that people heard them. I'll play a little of this.
Ed Sullivan. Me, Harry McAfee, appearing with Ed Sullivan. Ed Sullivan. Ed
So that is from the show Bye Birdie, but it's not from the original album. It's from the cast of Bye Birdie on the Ed Sullivan Show. Now, your grandparents may have told you a little bit about the Ed Sullivan Show. It was extremely popular. It was on Sunday nights from 1948 to 1971. And anybody know what Ed Sullivan did before he became a not very elegant talk show host? Pardon? What kind of reporter? He was the Broadway reporter for the New York Daily News. He knew all these people. He loved all these people. So if you saw, more people saw more, I think it's something like 116 shows from Broadway were presented on the Ed Sullivan Show. The non-performer who appeared the most on the Ed Sullivan Show was Richard Rodgers. He appeared 17 times. Not just from, would you like to sit up, but actually on stage conducting. So for millions of people, you could get 20 minutes of a show from Broadway in your living room, courtesy of Ed Sullivan. And of course, there are all those variety shows, Perry Como and Bing Crosby and all that stuff. So it was a very kind of lively thing that happened. And of course, when rock and roll comes in 1954, everything starts to shift. The week that Elvis Presley released his first single, It's All Right, in 1954, was the same week that Rosemary Clooney released her recording of Hey There from the Pajama Game, which went to #1 for 5 weeks. Okay, so that to me is kind of like this little pivot point. I won't talk too much about pop and rock and roll, but clearly rock music starts to become a very, very mighty competitor. And certainly with shows like Hair and the Beatles. Hair was that one of rare sort of rock show that succeeded on Broadway, but certainly the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and into the 70s, the rock wins the war, right? And it's very, very, very rare for anything from Broadway to hit the charts, the pop charts. And people say, what about Memory? What about Tomorrow from Annie? No, they were like barely blips. Like maybe they got to 42 for 2 weeks. It just, the world really, really changed. But I don't necessarily think that was for the worse, because you still had some pretty astonishing songs. I'm going to play you the last song from Broadway, not as an album, but as a pop single to make it on the charts. Make it in the top 10.
What do you get when you fall in love? A guy with a pen to thirst your love. That's what you get for the trouble. Never gonna love again.
That's obviously I'll Never Fall in Love Again from Promises. Promises, it's 1969, 1970. So 1970 is the last time a song from Broadway was a pop song. But for me, as someone who has to curate music from Broadway, and this last Sunday I played a song from the Prom, and then next week I'm going to play some of the score to Tootsie. So I try to play stuff that's fairly current, with the exception of Hamilton, which has set up a whole new interest in music from Broadway. When the Hamilton album debuted, it debuted at, I think, number 11. That's the highest that an album had charted since Camelot went to number 4 in 1961, the show album. What I find fascinating is that when people download music, as most of what people do now, 94% of anything downloaded from Hamilton is the entire album. And that's unheard of in pop music, right? So if Beyonce or Ariel Grande comes out with an album and it's got 14, 12, 13 songs, you download them, people only down 1 or 2 songs. But most people, by far most people, almost 100% of people, want all of Hamilton. Why? Because it's a story, it's a narrative, and they want to follow that trajectory much as their parents wanted to follow the trajectory of Jesus Christ Superstar, and their parents wanted to follow the trajectory of South Pacific, and their parents wanted to follow the trajectory of Oklahoma or something like that. So I'll play one little thing, just because I'm, and those of you who, I should just say in passing, who bought CDs or owned some of these scores on CDs, maybe you're in that middle road between the flat black round things and this crazy digital downloading thing. The CD world changed a lot, and I'll just sort of say that parenthetically, because as opposed to 55 minutes where you had to flip it over, you could obviously get up to 70, sometimes 80 minutes per disc. And that was a boon to shows because you could put the whole show on there. Sometimes a lot of extra music, sometimes I don't think so great. I think the constraints of technology in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s allowed people to make more interesting choices on their albums, personal opinion. But now, also so many of these flop shows, Merrily We Roll Along, Working, a Stephen Schwartz show which ran 18 performances in 1979, was recorded for Columbia and then released on CD, and everybody does, in fact, it's being done at New York at Encores right now. So these albums give a life to these shows that may not make it on Broadway, or to songs. The song Bewitched, Bothered and Bewildered, which I know you all know, was never recorded when Pal Joey was writing in 1940. It wasn't recorded until 1949 when a cocktail pianist recorded it for an album. And then Mel Torme sang it, Doris Day sang it, and it's gone on. So these are interesting lines. Here's somebody who I think has never appeared on a Broadway stage, appeared in a couple of Broadway movies. I think he did more for Broadway than almost any single person in terms of his music.
I should like to sing a very quiet song for you, if I may. I think this is a good time in the program to slow down a little bit. I don't know what that other guy is talking back to me. There's a show. Why don't you come inside the building? Get the hell out of the parking lot. No, I'm sorry. I know it's a big building, and I'm trying to do the best I can. But there's been a show running around the country. It opened here in New York about a year ago called A Little Night Music. And a wonderfully talented man named Stephen Sondheim wrote the score, and he has a specific song that's quite beautiful, and it's called "Send in the Clowns." And you see, if I don't smoke, I choke a lot when I sing. This is a very beautiful song. It's poignant and it's sad. It tells a story of two adult people who have been together for many years, and one day one of them gets restless and takes a walk, and the other one has this kind of a lament. Isn't it rich? Are we a pair? Me here at last on the ground, you in mid-air. Send in the clowns.
I'm just going to skip to the end, which is extraordinary to me.
Sorry. Isn't it queer? Losing my timing this late in my career. But where are the clouds? There ought to be clouds. Don't Isn't that a glorious song? A marvelous song. And it's such a breeze of delight that has come through the music business to get a song like that once in a while, instead of the acid rock 24 hours a day.
I'm assuming some of you can endorse that. Sinatra, of course, he was the first person to record Send in the Clowns commercially. It opened on Broadway in March of 1973, and the story goes that he was sitting by his pool in Palm Springs, and someone gave him an envelope, and manila envelope in April 1st or whatever, and that was that song. And he said, I'm going to come out of retirement and record that. So it never went to #1. It's been recorded by everybody under the sun. It's never been a big pop hit, but it's part of our pop consciousness, right? And to me, the idea that Sinatra, who'd been singing Broadway songs since 1936, sort of said, that's an important song. The world should know that song. And for my money, even more important in this Live in Madison Square event, he'd been singing it for about a year, he talks about Stephen Sondheim. He totally screws up the story of the show. I mean, we sort of, this is what happens and blah, blah, blah. Not exactly right, but it doesn't matter. Sinatra thinks it's important enough to spend the time setting up the context we talked about earlier so that you can better appreciate the content of the song. And I guess if I have any mantra as a DJ or as a writer, it's that yes, these original cast albums are great, they're an important part of our past, but we should also honor the artists who saw the magic of Broadway and brought their own personality to it in so many different ways so that so many people could enjoy it over the decades up to today. So that's the talk part. I'm sure some of you... I should add that if you haven't already, I have a show every 3 o'clock on WPPB 88.3, 3 to 4. It's a new episode every week. I've done 316 episodes now. You can go to iTunes and get them all. You can download them as podcasts, so keep on listening. But you may have some questions about Broadway, past or present. Yes?
You had Dionne Warwick, I think, from '69.
Yeah.
When was the color barrier breached for Broadway tunes?
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, that was breached in 1910 when Burt Williams sang Nobody from the Ziegfeld Follies of 1910 on recordings. Louis Armstrong recorded Ain't Misbehavin' in 1930. He was on stage singing that song in a show called Hot Chocolates. Showboat, the list is sort of St. Louis Woman, Jamaica, Lena Horne, Sammy Davis. The list is sort of endless.
So there wasn't the same white cover phenomenon that's associated with pop music going into the 50s?
No, not at all. I would say quite the opposite. People like Ethel Waters was a major recording artist who recorded stuff from Broadway in the 1930s and 40s. Again, Sammy Davis. These were the people. Louis Armstrong, Billy Eckstine, Lena Horne, Sarah Vaughan, Ella Fitzgerald. There's an Ella Louis thing coming up here. These were, in many ways, these performers were the vanguard of Broadway music for many people. When the Beatles, you all know the Beatles, right? You know the Beatles, right? The Beatles in 1964, in the fall of 1964, they had, on the singles charts, they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the top 5 songs on the charts. Their singles, She Loves Me, whatever it was. The person who broke through that and went to #1, beat them, was Louis Armstrong's recording of Hello Dolly. He was the man who beat the Beatles. Other questions? Yes?
How is it that Stephen Sondheim isn't as appreciated as Lin-Manuel Miranda, for instance, in his own realm? Sondheim is so brilliant, and in spite of Lerner and Lowe and Rodgers and Hammerstein and all the others of Hart, Moss Hart.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I would agree with that. I think his body of work is enormous. His body of work is over 60 years long. Lin-Manuel Miranda is a phenomenon. He's also a performer, which is important. Sondheim performed at Town Hall 2 nights ago, and he sang a song. He said, "I never perform on stage." So that has a lot to do with it. I think you raise a really interesting point, though. All of Stephen Sondheim's shows, not a single one of them, even for shows that he wrote the lyrics, like Gypsy and West Side Story, ran over 1,000 performances, ever. Or a show like Chicago, Kendra Evans runs 7,000 performances. I assume Hamilton will run 8,000 performances. But he came of age, and the major game changer for Sondheim, and I'm so glad you brought that up, is his songs are so specifically written for those shows that somehow they're more difficult to take out of context. And I have amazing performers do his stuff. Edie Gourmet sings a version of Sending the Clown Says, "Knock Your Socks Off." I think it's the best version ever, as does he, by the way.
Really?
It's just that as Sinatra feels like the need to kind of set it up, because it's not just, Some Enchanted Evening, it's the greatest song ever written, right? But it can be said by anybody, anywhere, at any time. I think Sondheim once said, "I can't write a love song. But if you tell me to write a song about a woman in a red raincoat holding an umbrella under a street lamp at 4 a.m. when it's raining, I can write that song. So it's just a change in how the tastes work in the world. Yes?
Penny mentioned that you're working on another project with Come From Away.
Yeah.
Which I'd love to hear a little bit about. I was just blown away by the
How many
show.
people know about, has anybody seen Come From Away?
Yeah.
So Come From Away, as some of you do know, is based on a real incident on the afternoon, or the morning of 9/11, 2001. 38 planes were diverted from transatlantic airspace to this tiny, tiny, tiny town on this tiny, tiny island of Newfoundland in Canada. And these planes stayed there for a week, and I think there were 10,000 people in the town and 7,000 people on the planes. So their population almost doubled overnight. And what happened that week is told rather extraordinarily in a musical called Come From Away. So I've written what's called the companion book. So I've written, and I'll have the libretto of the show, but I've written the whole history of what happened that week in 9/11, the story of the creation of the show, and it's going to come out mid-September, I think.
I mean, I just saw the staging.
Yeah, it was brilliantly staged.
Yeah.
Other questions about anything? Yes, you can ask another question. You're allowed.
This
Oh,
lady.
for her first, yes.
Did they use the music from the plays when they made them into movies? For instance, West Side Story, South Pacific. Was that the originals people?
If I had 17 hours, I could answer your question. Because that is one of the most complicated things, right? So back in the 30s, 20s and 30s, if you've ever seen Babes in Arms with Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland, or Girl Crazy with Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland, even Lady in the Dark with Ginger Rogers, they have Lady Be Good. They have nothing to do with the shows. They would buy the title, they would buy one or two of the songs, and sometimes it would be completely rewritten. Once Oklahoma came out, that was very difficult to do because people would have been outraged. Well, first of all, Rodgers and Hammerstein wouldn't have let anybody else write a song in their movie, and people wanted to see that thing. And the whole, there are very, very few. I can really only think of one off the top of my head. Very few movie musicals based on Broadway shows that use all of the score from Broadway. 1776 is one of the few that actually is a very good record of what happened on Broadway. But even songs, Oklahoma, Lonely Room was cut from the film of Oklahoma. Carousel had a bunch of stuff. Carousel is a terrible movie. Frank Sinatra was supposed to play Billy Bigelow in the film of Carousel. And he pre-recorded some of the tracks with Shirley Jones, which are brilliant. And he showed up, location shooting first day at Booth Bay Harbor in Maine. And he wore a stripe, you know, one of those striped things, right, like you have, and a kerchief. And he was like, okay, where do I go? And he said, wait a minute, bring the producer up. He said, Henry, there's a camera there and a camera there. What's that for? And he said, oh, well, Frank, we're shooting it in CinemaScope 22 and VistaVision because you're going to be shown in different theaters. So you're going to have to do every scene twice, one for that camera and one for that one. And he said, are you paying me twice? And they say, no, of course not, Frank. He said, that's it. And he got in his car and he drove away. And the producer was in tears. And Shirley Jones was running around and says, I need a bunch of dimes. Who's got a bunch of dimes? Because she went to the payphone to call Gordon McRae in Las Vegas, who she had done Oklahoma with, and said, can you be here in 2 days? And he said yes. And that's why Gordon McRae and not Frank Sinatra is in the film version of that. But it's always very tricky. I mean, as I'm saying, you could just, comparisons between the film and the movie. And also what's happened in the last few years, how many people have seen the film of Evita or Chicago? Either or both. They add a song for the movie so it can be nominated for an Academy Award. Because you can't win an Academy Award for a song that already appeared on Broadway. So you would sometimes have these little oddball songs that they throw in there at the last minute to get a contract. Other questions? Yes?
You mentioned the prom and
Tootsie.
some of the Tootsie.
Yeah.
So obviously the prom is closing already. There's that Cher's behind it. What's happening to these musicals?
I think there's a little bit of a nuclear winter. This was actually, I think, a good season for a lot of shows. I think one of the extraordinary things that I've noticed, because I have an 11-year-old boy, is that there are shows now marketed for high schoolers. Be More Chill, which is closing, The Prom, but Dear Evan Hansen, Mean Girls. So those 4 shows are very similar. They're all set in high schools. I don't know that Broadway can sustain 4 of them. Maybe they can only sustain 2 of them. And there was a Cher show was opposite Ain't Too Proud. And I think Ain't Too Proud is doing better, so maybe there's only one jukebox musical that can be sustained. I'll tell you a story. I brought my son to see he was 6, the 2016 revival of Fiddler on the Roof on Broadway with Danny Burstein. Maybe some of you saw that. Not the Yiddish one that's playing, but a couple of years ago. And he said, as the house lights were going down, he sat up on his booster seat, and I guess maybe he saw the poster or something. He said, "Dad," and I said, "What is it, Miles?" He said, "Is this a Jewish thing?" And I said, "Miles, it is the Jewish thing." Other questions?
When Chicago opened, it got terrible reviews, and yet later on, when it came back, it just kept going on and on.
Sort of, yeah, yes and no. Chicago, the original with Gwen Verdon and Cheetah Rivera, directed by Bob Fosse, Ken Burnett, opened in 1975, 2 weeks after another show opened, called A Chorus Line, which is a little bit to your point. And it got great reviews, but the audiences just, they were only going to pay their $17.50 to see one show, right? And it was going to be A Chorus Line. And then when Encores brought it back, it also opened in 1997 after the O.J. Simpson trial. So a lot of people thought the audiences were a little more prepared for the level of that show. Maybe take 2 more questions. Anybody who didn't get a chance to ask a question? Okay, yes, go ahead.
I have 2 questions.
Oh, well, there you are. You used up everybody's kit.
One, how is it that the Brits, who had an opportunity early on, never really developed the musical theater like Broadway? Was it because they didn't have the people to write the music, they didn't have the heart for it, or
well,
because they look?
If I had 1/2 of 1/4 of 1% of Andrew Lloyd Webber's royalties, I wouldn't be here talking to you.
But that came much later on.
No, I think that did come later. I think, I actually have a couple shows, radio shows called West End Winners. I mean, the Brits' attempt to write an American musical in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s until Jesus Christ Superstar, and then of course in the 80s, Cats and Evita and stuff like that, were miserable. I don't know, I mean that's sort of a magic question. I think there is something American about the American musical. They tell stories about us, there's a kind of yearning, there's a kind of optimism, there's a sense of family in tons of Broadway musicals. It's interesting that The Sound of Music, obviously a big hit on Broadway, ran about 500 performances longer in London in the 60s than it did in New York. And every time it gets revived, it always does better in London. And people say, which I think is interesting, because of that story, right, that's a family that stayed together and escaped the Nazis, but they stayed together. In England, so many families were separated during World War II, and kids were sent to the countryside, that to them it resonated in a way it doesn't resonate with Americans. Interesting story.
The other question is very prosaic. You spoke about grandparents, but we have we have 78s and we have long playing records. Are they of any value today to be sold to? Is there any outlet? Because we really feel.
I don't know. If you asked me this 3 years ago, I would say I'm afraid not. I think certainly 78s are not valuable because A, they're breakable, and B, they're heavy. And
what about
few people have those machines anymore, right? Vinyl has made a comeback. And so depending on the condition of your LP, it probably, if it's My Fair Lady, probably not, because there's 72 million of those out in the world. But some of the rarer shows maybe. And it's interesting, Come From Away was just released on vinyl as an LP, because it's become a bit of a collector's thing. Hamilton, I have a very rare 3 LP set of Hamilton. Again, how many people know The Most Happy Fella by Frank Lasser, one of the greatest shows ever written? That was this utter rarity. Back in 1956, they recorded 3 records, 3 LPs. So you have a whole show. Supposedly Goddard Lieberson was in the studio, and he liked it so much, he said, I don't give a crap how much it costs. Let's record the whole thing, because it's an important work of art. And I think that's another little flip thing. Because of CDs, it's much easier to record things now digitally than before. You needed a full orchestra. You could do it off tracks and things like that. Shows that flop, even shows that don't make it, even into New York, have a cast album now because they're easier to reproduce. And that's what keeps these shows alive in many ways. So if people want to know more about this fabulous story, I'll be sitting right there. I'll be happy to sign your book, and I'd love to chat with you more. And thanks so much for coming today.
book sales, as you know, the library doesn't sell books except in our bookshop. And we're a library, so people borrow books, but remember, writers write books and they need people to buy them. So if you're inclined, please step over there and you can buy this wonderful book. And I
Help
have
me
to say,
finish my kitchen.
we're so happy that you are writing another book that will be published in time for you to come out and pay another visit. So thank you all for coming. It's been a really wonderful.